Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 2. I'm going to go ahead and continue with Deuteronomy 21 verse 13. And it says, "And she shall put the raiment of her captivity from off of her, and shall remain in thy house, and bewail her father and her mother a full month. And after that thou shalt go in unto her, and be her husband, and she shall be thy wife." And so this is referring to the consummation of the covenant. And as I said earlier, I believe the full month could be a reference to the full moon. It could be a reference to the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs at the full moon. And I'll talk about the various dates that could be possible dates for the Feast of Tabernacles a little bit later. And then it says, "And it shall be, if thou have no delight in her, then thou shalt let her go whither she will. But thou shalt not sell her at all for money. Thou shalt not deal with her as a slave, because thou hast humbled her. And if a man have two wives, the one beloved and the other hated, and they have borne him children, both the beloved and the hated, and if the firstborn son be hers that was hated, then it shall be in the day that he causeth his sons to inherit that which he hath, that he may not make the son of the beloved the firstborn before the son of the hated, who is the firstborn." And what I believe this is talking about, like I had said earlier, I believe this is talking about the Jews and the Gentiles. And what I want to explain here is saying, I'll go back to the example of Jacob and the two wives. Leah had Judah, which represents Israel, and Rachel had Joseph and Benjamin, and Joseph was the father of Manasseh and Ephraim was the youngest. So it's saying that you're not allowed to make the youngest be the firstborn of the one that's born to the beloved. You cannot make that child be the firstborn over the one that was hated. And what I believe this is referring to is, if you go to Romans 1, I'll show you that in a second. Okay, over here in verse 16, it says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile," or to the Greek. So salvation is to the Jew first. So even though the blessing of the firstborn was given to Ephraim, which was the youngest, he was the first one to receive salvation spiritually. The Gentiles received the gospel first before the Jews, because the Jews are currently blinded. But as far as the redemption, once the Lord returns, salvation will come to the Jew first, and then to the Gentiles. And I'll take you to Romans 11 to show you that there as well. And like I've said before, the number 11, I believe, represents the two types of DNA and the restoration once the two become one, which will be represented by the Jews and the Gentiles coming together, which will happen literally, I believe, but it's also a depiction of the restoration of the temple, because the temple will be complete, will be made up of the Jews and the Gentiles the way it's supposed to be. The bride will be both Jew and Gentile the way she's supposed to be. Even though it's two wives now, it'll be one. There'll be one bride. But over here, I'll just put in the word fullness. I can find it easier that way. There's two fullnesses that have to take place in Romans 11. A lot of people talk about the fullness of the Gentiles, but they forget about where it talks about the fullness of the Jews. And over here in verse 12, it's talking about the fullness of the Jews. And it's saying, "Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness Okay, so over here it says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation is come to the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. And then this is the verse that I just read. And then it goes on to say, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office, if by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead, which is the resurrection? So the resurrection is not going to occur until Israel is received, until the natural branches are received and grafted back in. Then we can pass from death to life. But that's not going to happen until Israel is redeemed. And then it talks about the other fullness, which would be the fullness of the Gentiles. Over here in verse 25 it says, for I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So they're only blinded until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. But then once the blindness is removed, we can't pass from death to life until Israel is restored and received back in and reconciled. Once Israel is reconciled, then we can pass from death to life, and the two partake together of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. And I'll start over here with verse 16. It says, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And the root would be Jesus. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So both will partake of the root and the fatness of the olive tree together. This word partakest, it comes from this word right here in the Greek, which has this prefix, the prefix syn, which means together, like with words like synchronize. It's this word right here. It means with. So they partake with at the same time. They're co-partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So they both receive the oil together, the holy oil, the two witnesses, the Jews and the Gentiles, the two anointed ones that are talked about in Zechariah 4 and in Revelation 11. And then it goes on to say, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So we're not to boast against the branches. There's a lot of people boasting against Israel, talking about how, Israel is going to be left behind, and we're going to get raptured first, and then God's going to turn his focus back on Israel, which may be the case for the Israel that is not part of the remnant, but over here it talks about the remnant as well. It says, even so, then at this present time there's also a remnant according to the election of grace. So there's a remnant, a part of the remnant that's according to the election of grace, which would be the Gentiles, but there's the original remnant that was talked about in the Old Testament that's talked about here, where it says, but what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. And this represents the original remnant that was talked about in the Old Testament. So there's going to be a remnant of natural Israel and a remnant according to the election of grace, and both together make up the remnant, the 144,000, that are sealed, because it's not just the 12 tribes of Israel that are sealed. Anyone who has the Holy Spirit is sealed, so the Gentiles are sealed as well. So they both make up the remnant of the 144,000. And I'll just show you that right here in Revelation 14. It says, "And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers, harping with their harps, and they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000, which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb." So you see Jesus is standing here with the 144,000 on Mount Zion, and this is in Revelation 14:1 through Revelation 14:4. Then if you go to Zechariah 14:4, you'll see that this is when Jesus sets foot on the Mount of Olives. It says, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Azal. Yea, ye shall flee like as you fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee." So the Lord God is going to come with all the saints when the Mount of Olives cleaves. And this word cleave refers to the cleaving that takes place between a man and a woman when they're married, which refers to the bride of Christ and Christ, as is talked about in Ephesians 5:30, where it says, "For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church." So the splitting of the Mount of Olives refers to the splitting of the DNA, which will then cleave once it's restored, just as the bride of Christ and Christ will cleave together once the DNA is restored. You see that here in 1 Corinthians 15:52, where it says, well, starting with 51, it says, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed." And over here where it says, "in the twinkling of an eye," in a moment, the word moment in Greek is the word atom, which refers to the smallest molecule that cannot be cut, because it's saying over here, it comes from the word atom, and it says that cannot be cut into or divided, indivisible. So the implication is that it's the smallest particle that cannot be divided. And so we're going to be changed in an atom, so the atom is going to be split. The smallest particle is going to be divided at that time once the DNA is restored. And then it's going to be reattached to the correct DNA or the correct helix, and that's why it's going to cleave. So there's a play on the word cleave. It's going to cleave as far as being split, but then it's going to cleave as far as being joined back together. And I'm about out of time, so I'm going to have to continue in the next video.